Welcome everybody to the third part of the TECaN and ONTPD virtual job search series. We're on our third year. Take a couple seconds to use a QR code for our REDCap survey. It will help us a lot in terms of making this version 4.0 even better. Look at for Zoom links for upcoming sessions. I'd like to introduce Sarah Bernstein, who's been one of my partners in crime for the job series for the last 2 years, and who is a faculty member at in Utah. And I'd like to introduce one of my own excellent fellows, Blair Simon, who's a first-year fellow at Northwestern Lurie. Both of them are on the amazing TECaN leadership group. So without any further ado, Sarah and Blair, take it away.
We have four great panelists here. I'm really excited that you guys were all able to join us. We have your slides up, starting with Dr. Luck. Ash, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, and please feel free to call me Ashley. Still feel too junior to be getting that formal with titles. So I'm Ashley. I'm originally from Florida, did residency at UT Southwestern with a chief year, did my first fellowship at Baylor, did a second fellowship, not ACGME boarded, but kind of one of those extra ones that's starting to bubble up in fetal neurology. And then had a 2-year faculty appointment at Children's National in DC. And then came now to what is my first full deep roots, bought a house job in Austin at UT Austin. My practice setting is very unique. I think I'm in a true hybrid setting, meaning I'm employed by Mednax Pediatrics, get a private practice salary with a private practice bonus structure, while being a full faculty appointment at UT Austin in a freestanding level 4 children's hospital, where we have a med school, a residency program, and we are welcoming our first class of NICU fellows, for which I'm the associate program director. So I think it's a really cool, unique setup. There's a few places like that in the pediatrics company across the country, but it's definitely not your typical private practice. And then my interests are there on the slides: neuro, advocacy, and medical education.
Great. You have some really amazing experiences, especially for being so junior and not super far out, and we've gotten to work together a whole lot. So I know you're going to have some really great advice for everybody. Our next panelist is Dr. Max Mathias.
Oh, so hi, I'm Max Mathias. So I am originally from Boston, or I guess Sharon. So I did my residency in New York, and med school in New York, and then I went over to Chicago with Patrick and where Blair is, and Davlin, and did my fellowship at Lurie Children's and Northwestern. In fellowship, I got some experience with pulmonary hypertension, and spent some time doing some basic science research, and decided to pursue that as my faculty career, having not really spent much time in a lab before fellowship. And I ended up coming here to Oklahoma City so that I could be working with a really great mentorship program for junior faculty in my research area of interest. And so the setting here is a large kind of level 3, level 4 NICU, both combined in Oklahoma City. And I'm happy to kind of talk more about that in a targeted way when we get to our questions.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us, Max. Next, we have Dr. Tom Pawlowski. Am I saying that correctly, Tom?
Yes, you are. It's Tom Pawlowski. Great to be here, and thanks so much for the invitation to join you guys. Happy to chat with everybody. So I'm a kind of Philly lifer, Philadelphia lifer. I grew up in the area. I did my medical school at Drexel, my residency and fellowship training at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And I'm currently stayed on as faculty through the University of Pennsylvania, Paramount School of Medicine. And so I practice really at our level 3. My office is based out of our level 3 center, downtown Philadelphia, which is a busy level 3 perinatal center. But I split my clinical time also at the level 4 unit, just across town. And my interests really are kind of dedicated. I've always wanted to be a clinical neonatologist, but involved with academics. And so my academic interest has evolved into point of care ultrasound and teaching and implementation, specifically at our level 3, specifically and initially for vascular access, but then hopefully broadening to some more diagnostic usages as well.
Wonderful. And finally, we have Dr. Davlin Tillman, who is also here to join us today.
Hello. Hi. Feel free to call me Davlin as well. Same as Ashley. I don't feel quite seasoned enough, but I'm originally from Memphis, Tennessee, and then pretty much all of kind of med school training and up into a fellowship was spent in parts of Chicago. So did residency at Advocate Christ Medical Center in Oak Lawn, Illinois, so kind of South Chicago, and then did fellowship with Patrick and Blair and Max. I'm at Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago, and I'm currently working as my first attending job at Baylor/Texas Children's Hospital in Houston. So my practice setting, of course, is again, an urban large academic center. We do service in a variety of units. So there's like a large medical center, if you're familiar, and there's a level 4 unit there that I do work in, and a level 2, level 3. So there's a level 4 kind of within sort of the main hospital. There's a level 4, level 3 delivery hospital, as well as a level 2 that's sort of down the hall from our level 4 that we do work in as well. And then I also do service in a level kind of more of our sort of Medicaid, sort of public insurance population. I do service at the level 3 unit there. So it's sort of kind of all of the things sort of within the same sort of 20-minute radius. My interests are generally perinatal health disparities and hoping to kind of turn some epidemiology disparities work that I did in fellowship into more kind of advocacy and policy work. So.
Wonderful. And thank you all for joining us today. We're really excited to have you here and be able to pick your brain. As Blair and Patrick mentioned, we have a couple of questions that were prepared ahead of time based on things that people submitted or questions in the past for our panelists. If feel free to submit other questions as they come up, and anyone who's not speaking, we'll try to address them in the chat. And Blair and I, if there's time permitting, we'll get to them at the end, or there will be a follow-up for anything that we can't get to. So with that, I will let Blair jump back in.
See, now I got it. Now I'm going to ask the questions. All right. All right. So to start again, our first question is actually for Ashley. So how do we go about preparing a CV coming from this fellowship position of looking to get into a junior faculty position?
Yeah, it's a good question. I noticed, I don't think we have a question about cover letters. I actually feel like cover letters are more important than the CV in terms of really getting your story out there. But to answer the CV part, when I was approaching it, I got cover letters from a variety of CVs from a variety of faculty members to see how they formatted it. I think it's really helpful to present your CV. It doesn't so much matter like the font and the formatting, whether you're using your institution. I wouldn't recommend spending the time to convert your CV into each individual institution's format of where you're applying. Someone gave me that advice and I tried it for like an hour and then I just thought there's no time for this. So don't worry so much about that. It's more about, like you always hear, grammatical mistakes and errors, but also just clearly portraying something that matches your cover letter. So for example, for me, I had a lot of medical education and neuro research and AAP involvement. So I asked people who had been involved in the AAP to see how they formatted it, and actually got a copy of someone who was a cardiologist to see how they separated their involvement in an organization from like a national, regional, local format, which I thought was really helpful. And then also looked at, you know, other junior faculty who were in research to see how they formatted the information for their grants as well as their publications, and just kind of took pieces of the different types of careers and then melded that to be the format for my CV. And so you know, ideally your CV kind of is a little bit different from anybody else's in terms of the way that you spin your story. But I really think the more important thing is the cover letter than the CV in terms of, I see a lot of standard cover letters that are about, this is where I trained, I did this many months of level 3 and level 4, I did or didn't, you know, do PICC lines or ECMO or whatever, which is helpful, but most places already know what your training is like just from where you came from. Like if you are training at a place that has a level 3-4 NICU, you know, that has a long history of having a fellowship program, like most places just know what your training is like, unless you're at a unique place where they, perhaps they're in a unique setting. Like for the fellows that are in our program, I'm going to stress that it's important to talk about what it's like to train in a hybrid place. But for the traditional setting, people know kind of what you got in terms of your clinical, because it's so ACGME regulated. It's so much more important to talk about what are you going to do in your first 5 years as faculty member? What are you going to bring to the division that doesn't already exist? And who are you going to partner with, or who are you, you know, who do you see yourself as being a junior mentee of? Props, you know, perhaps like if there's a big, for example, for me, a huge neuroscience research center, then I'm going to talk about that in my cover letter of why that is a good fit for me at that place. I'm trying to keep my answers short so other people can talk.
No, that was great, especially the part about the cover letter. Devlin, do you have any, like, I guess, like, so you're the next person that we have to answer this question.
Yeah, I am second Ashley. I think the cover letter matters more because that's more of kind of the story, right? Like where you've come from and what you sort of see for your future. As far as kind of just the logistics of a CV, I was sort of a Google person. So I literally, like AMA and New England Journal of Medicine have like articles on CVs, and it's just sort of pros as to like how should you word it? What are sort of good ways to phrase things? And actually the Neonatology Solutions website was pretty good for just providing examples. And so kind of same, I like looked at just like put together like a lot of different CVs and tried to format mine in a similar sense and just see what people included, just to get a sense from that standpoint. As well as like even when you have visiting professors that come to like speak during fellowship and things, just like take a look at their CV and see how they structured it, because obviously theirs got them, you know, very far. So, but similar thing for the cover letter. I think speaking to some of like the junior faculty and really just talking about what you can offer to the section, and from your research, what the section could potentially offer to you is important. So.
I want to hop into with cover letter advice. I agree with everything that Ashley and Devlin was saying. I think this is a time really to kind of speak to your strengths and really sell yourself, right? This is your story of why you should be hired there. You need to have confidence in this. You need to sell yourself. You need to give them a reason why they want to hire you and bring you on to their faculty member. So I think it needs to be, the cover letter needs to be your story. You need to kind of tactfully boast about yourself, not in an egregious way or in an obnoxious way, but really speak to your strengths and give them a reason to say, hey, we really want you to join our faculty member and you can bring this to the table. And I think a lot of your fellowship directors and other junior faculty members can help you read through your cover letters and say, oh, this may work, this may not work with your wording, and you may want to kind of prop up this a little bit more than that, and really kind of give insightful advice as you kind of put it all together. I certainly used and screened a lot of our junior faculty members and our fellowship directors with help with my cover letter.
Did anyone else have any input on cover letters and CVs before we go to the next question? Okay, good. So our next question, this time I'll get started with you, Dallin. So our next question is one, did you use a recruiter to reach out to potential employers? And then in that process of actually reaching out to different employers, kind of like what was your timeline? Because we're kind of just trying to figure out what is an appropriate timeline in fellowship for you to start looking for jobs.
Yes, so I'll say my situation was a little, hopefully different than what it will be moving forward. I was one of the pandemic job searchers. So, so yeah, 2020 was an interesting time. So take my advice with a grain of salt. Hopefully it's better. But I typically, in general, I reach, so because of that, like a lot of, I mean, it was, you know, kind of summer 2020, right? A lot of children's hospitals that lost money and sort of the budget, you know, the budgets weren't sort of, very clear at the time. So it was hard to quote unquote start early. And so I was sort of at the mercy at a lot of places, sort of budgeting capabilities. As far as reaching out, I feel like I typically reached out to practices, and this is where you just start to kind of network and, you know, talk to some attendings and things of that nature. What have you heard? What have you heard? And so in general, I reached out to practices because of sort of the job situation, pandemic job situation at that time. I was generally trying to cast a wide net. And so for some of the kind of pediatrics and mednex jobs, I did use a recruiter for regions that I thought I might be interested in. So I did a little bit of both just to make sure that I covered my bases there. But in general, so I pretty much found myself like I would find like the section chair or department chair of the place I was interested in and send my CV, send mostly my cover letter, but cover letter and or CV, and just see if I got a response. But a lot of it was, especially because of that time, was sort of networking and figuring out who was hiring at the time and then following up on those opportunities. So in a general sense, I think I would say during that time, sort of starting to have conversations and pick my attendings' brains and things of that nature, probably late summer, early fall. I would say that I didn't really get the ball rolling on like actual interviews and like hearing back from people until fall, and in our situation, even sort of kind of into winter and even early spring. But I would say start to get things together in the summertime. And then also, I would say, if not late summer, at least by early fall, kind of definitely be sort of hitting the ground running.
Great. So Tom, your next question, do you have any thoughts on that?
Much like Devlin, I was also a coronavirus job search person. So I'm finishing up my first year, and it was more than scary, but thankfully it all worked out for everybody. So just like it will work out for all of you guys out there watching this as well too. So I think in that timeline, we were, Devlin, I'm not sure if you joined a similar meeting like this, a job search committee, and I think that was in August of 2020. And then I got out all of my cover letters and CV pretty much by the end of September. So I almost felt like I was a little bit later, because when during this kind of meeting a couple years ago, some people had already started reaching out to division chiefs and job searching already. Obviously, everybody's in different scenarios and different situations. So I got most of mine out by the end of September, and then interviews were late October, November, early December, and some offers came in December to January. So that was kind of like my overall time frame. I really relied heavily and thankfully on the support of our division chief, who offered to contact other division chiefs on our behalf, kind of like see if they had, basically I culminated a geographic, like different places that I was interested in. I was relatively geographically limited. And once I identified programs that I think would be a match, I asked our division chief to reach out to those other division chiefs to at least kind of make a connection and forward my information on my behalf. And that worked with variable success. But I thought that was a nice way to kind of, instead of cold calling division chiefs, where it's kind of easy for them to, you know, miss your email or kind of it get lost in the shuffle, having someone reach out on your behalf was really kind of helpful and at least kind of broke the ice a bit. And then after that, we were then in direct contact, myself with the division chief, to set up, see if there was mutual interest, and to have like kind of an initial phone call that may lead to interviews. So that was kind of my overall experience. I didn't use a recruiter. I wasn't interested in private practice, so I did focus mainly in academic institutions. However, they were academic institutions of variable levels, so larger level 4 units and big academic programs, and also some smaller academic programs. So I thought that was really nice. If of course, that's contingent on a division chief wanting to do that for you or offering to do that. So you can also see if there's other senior faculty members that are in your division that would be willing to kind of ask around of colleagues that they know, or if you have mentors and you have specific research interests, you can ask your mentors to see if there's anyone that they would feel comfortable reaching out with on your behalf as well. So basically the idea is to have if you're not using recruiter, have someone advocate for you to kind of break the ice with you, which I think was really helpful.
Great. I think that's really good advice and a smart way to go about it. Ashley, I was wondering really quick, I see you did a very nice response. If you can kind of just quickly chat about the difference between, if you use a recruiter, someone who's affiliated with a particular private practice versus independent, because I know that's something that was a new idea to me, and it sounds like was a learning experience for you as well.
Yeah. So I learned most of this because I interviewed a recruiter to do a podcast, and then happened to use her to interview at 2 places. So it was a very limited experience, but 2 important things to know about recruiters. 1, they get paid by bringing someone to a hospital, an applicant like us, that wouldn't have otherwise gotten connected to that hospital. So if you reach out to a place and contact their medical director, division chief, HR, whatever, once you've made that point of contact, you have now connected yourself. So a recruiter is seen as not being necessary to bring you into that practice. Therefore, they won't get paid for you signing a contract at that hospital anymore, which usually, because time is money equals, they're not going to help you with that job. So if you think you're going to use a recruiter, I would encourage you to meet with them early before you start contacting places, because they're going to be much more motivated to help you if they're making the initial point of contact. Once they make that first point of contact, there's nothing wrong with you reaching out and touching base with the medical director, division chief, whoever. But the recruiter then is financially hooked in, separate from you signing. They just get a flat fee usually of however many dollars for bringing an interview in or for signing. So that's just one point, is they're going to be much more helpful and open to you if you haven't already contacted a bunch of places. The second important thing is recruiters know about jobs that are posted. If there's a practice that knows in a year from now, one of their senior people is going to retire and they're going to be, wanting to replace them, that's not a job posting. So a recruiter is not going to know that that opportunity exists. So it really, has its limitations. Some pluses, the pluses I think are, if you really don't know where you want to work and you're just open to a private practice job in a level 3 somewhere, they're really good at scanning the whole country and figuring out what openings there are. If they work for a specific company, they're going to obviously be limited. So if you work with an Envision recruiter, they're only going to find Envision job openings for you. They are good for doing the paperwork part, like sending your stuff into HR and all that, and having awkward conversations. So I interviewed at one place and it was absolutely not a good fit. Just, I didn't think there was enough acuity. I didn't feel like it was academic enough. And that's a very awkward conversation to have. So you can put that on the recruiter to go back and have them explain why it's not a good fit, and you never actually have to contact them again. So if you're confrontation averse, that's helpful. And then 2, when you do get a contract and you're trying to negotiate money, they can go back for you and say, no, actually my client feels that this would be a more fair salary. And so if you really don't like those sorts of things or you don't have experience, they can be helpful there. But again, you're limited to what's open. And so that always begs that question of, why is a job posting still open for a year? What is it that they haven't filled that job? So that's always, can be an alarm, a pink flag, I would say. If you're applying to a place and it says, oh, this job opening has been listed for 2 years, is it just that they're growing so fast and they just really need that many people? Or have they had such high turnover? I would encourage you to look into that a little bit more. Why has that posting been up for so long?
Great. Thank you so much. We're going to transition a little bit to interviewing strategies and negotiation. This first question is for Max and Ashley. Given your own experience interviewing, what advice do you wish that you'd had when you were going through the initial application and interview process? We'll start with Max.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think generally, I'm trying to think of like, I mean, I got a lot of advice and I didn't listen to all of it. But I think there should be like an openness to different opportunities that you wouldn't have expected. And I say that as someone who you can see was spent a lot of time in New York and Chicago and is now in Oklahoma City. And so I think being open to like at least in 2020, 2021, every single interview was like an opportunity. Like it's an opportunity to practice interviewing. It's an opportunity to meet a group where you don't think that you would have wanted to go, but you might want to go. So I think that was something that was maybe kind of encouraged Patrick, that maybe we didn't listen to, and like in retrospect, I was like, oh, I kind of wish I'd done like a little bit more interviewing before I did the interview for the job I really, really wanted. And so I think that's something that maybe I wish I had known about myself, or like what, like that I was probably more open to situations, you know, where I wouldn't have been open to. Another thing I think is important is to know how to find out what it's really like. So I think, you know, finding the more junior faculty or connecting with faculty that you weren't necessarily scheduled to interview with, where you can, you know, you can have a question and say, you know, so what's your like when you run on the weekends, how many patients do you see? So I spoke to somewhere where they were like, oh yeah, we have to run on 50 patients on the weekends and they're till 8 p.m. and it's great. And I was like, that sounds terrible. Or is a service week? Is it 5 days or is it 7 days? Because that's, you know, almost, you know, that's like 40% more time. And so I think those are things that I just didn't know because I never had a job, and I didn't know to ask. And, you know, people will talk about their call schedules, but they're also dramatically different. So Ashley, I don't know if you have.
Yeah, I know, I agree. I think my first piece of advice would be interview at places if an opportunity presents that you might not have thought you would entertain. So when I've done 3 rounds of interviews, so take that for what it's worth in terms of experience. First as a 3rd-year fellow, then decided I was going to do a 2nd fellowship. So did a whole round of interviews at academic centers, you know, looking for that K award, NIH track job. Then at the end of 2nd fellowship, did another round of interviews, didn't find anything that clicked. And then ultimately ended up in this job through random Facebook message from someone that was like, you would love it here. And thank God I just, whatever, you know, sure, I'll go interview. What is it going to hurt at this point, right? And was totally shocked because I was in that whole like, private practice, it does not compute with my career. So, and like I said, not all practices are the same. If you've interviewed at one MEDNAX practice, then you've interviewed at one MEDNAX practice because they are all radically different across the country. So be open to opportunities that might not seem like what in your head, your preconceived notion of what the dream job is, and just try it out. You don't have anything to lose by going on an interview. Also helps to meet a lot of people and network for when you're trying to do research collaborations and things like that. And then the average time that people spend at their first job now is like 2 to 3 years. So it's very unlikely you're going to land your dream job right out the get-go. And there's a very high chance that you're going to switch and pivot. So it's always helpful to leave everything on good terms and keep connections. In terms of what I wish I had known, I think I focused so much on how much protected time am I going to get? How much protected time? How much service? And then when it came down to it, I got really good advice from Dr. Ann Stark, who's at Boston now, of like, no one's going to put that in your contract. No one anywhere, at least that I found, is going to put, you will do 22 weeks of service. Because if somebody goes on maternity leave or somebody leaves or whatever, Like it's all going to shift. And so if other people found that they got that written in without funding already, then please, give your experience with that. But I was so focused on that, and I needed to focus more on the environment. What were other junior faculty who were going down that track, whether it's, clinical, basic education, QI, whatever, like how were they doing? How supported did they feel? And I wish ahead of time I would have been a little bit more suggestive of what I wanted out of my interview day. Like, go on the website, look at all the junior faculty or ask other people and say, I would really love to meet with this person. Like if there's somebody there who seems very much like you, but maybe 3 to 5 years down the road, that's a great person to specifically say, I would like to meet with them. And most likely if they're junior, they're not going to have this packed calendar where they can't fit you in. So don't be shy to ask for specific people that are going to really help you with the things that are your hangups. Like figure out what your hangups are before you go somewhere, and then really try and drill down on those to figure out if that's a deal breaker or not from your interview.
Yeah, I mean, I will say I as a specifically looking for a research job, that it was able to get protected time written into the contract, but it was not written in a way like it was written in as if, so like in a research job, so a K-8 award for 75% protected. So, if there's 53 weeks a year, that means 13 weeks. Doing 13 clinical weeks is kind of a lot, I think, if you're like fully NIH track, but like that's what they're willing to do. So it wasn't like, and I don't work 13 clinical weeks really now, but I was able to like get like some kind of language in there, and absolutely, and I think that absolutely we weren't able to hire people, and exactly like Ashley said, like I had to take extra clinical weeks this year, even though I'm technically protected, because it's still less. I'm not working that kind of NIH 75% protected. Almost nobody who's K-8 funded works that much clinical time. It's just not possible for like a fully research track person. But also my clinical weeks are 7 days in a row, or really the 14 days in a row blocks. And so 2 clinical weeks for me is 14 days, not 10 days. And so like I might be working like a lot less than 13 clinical weeks, but the total amount of days I'm working is similar. And so there are like really like things like that where I think at least I was able to get that written in, but it's still like if I was going by the letter of my contract, then I would be working like crazy.
Yeah, I think those are all really great points. This next question is actually really a nice follow-up to some of that. And it's okay if you can't nail it down to one. You can feel free to use more than one. But I think, one of the things that I experienced, one of the things that I'm hearing from you guys is that it's sometimes, especially when you're new, it's your first job out, like it's really hard to even know like what questions to ask. And so with that sort of in mind, what do you think is the most important question to ask during interviews? Is there one specific? Are there a couple of things or like a theme that you would recommend that fellows try to hit on? And just general thoughts on that. We'll start with Davlin and then go to Tom, and then anyone else who wants to answer.
Yes, it was hard to nail it down to one. So I was I guess my question would be sort of the big picture thing. And I think like my question or questions would be, what is like, ask, especially if you meet with the division or section chair, like what is their vision for the department, and what resources do they have? What resources are available to help you succeed in your area of interest? And I found, your answer to that may be variable, but I found like the job I have now and just the general sense of comfort that I had walking into like a new division, I think that like the answer to that question really mattered. Like, for instance, I'm interested in perinatal health disparities, right? And so especially in the current times, it's sort of a hot topic, but different divisions may approach that differently. And so I really wanted to be at a place where I felt supported. And so to hear that like the vision for the department is to build a tier in disparities was like music to my ears. And so I think that is important. And just knowing that you may be supported in what your road may look like. And I think that it's also important to know, especially as junior faculty, we're still trying to figure out how to say yes and no. And so I think just knowing what the division chief's vision is may give you a sense of, aside from the things that you're interested in, what you may get pulled into or asked to do. So for instance, if they need more sort of people working in sort of the working in the CVICU as sort of consultants, then you just know that you may get pulled to do that. Or if their mission is to sort of build the fellowship and build their sort of education and mentorship program, know that you may get pulled to that too. So, because especially as you're building your own sort of research and career path, you may get called to be on those committees. So I thought that was kind of that was a good question to hear, so.
Yeah, I think that's really great, Devlin, and I agree with a lot of those questions. I think with these questions, there's no one magic question to ask, but I would encourage people to think about in themes. So like the theme of like, where's the division heading and what kind of funding and support and interest is there for my specific skill set, and a nice question with that it also is, where do you see me if we were to match together? Where would you see me in a year or 2 years, and how can I help the division grow or move forward, or where do you see my skill set kind of fitting in? I think then there's also like the big on my list was the culture of the program. So like you can just flat out ask, like, how would you describe the culture in your division? Or are people generally happy? Do they like coming to work? Do people interact with each other? If there's a difficult clinical question, do people collaborate and talk about it? All these things are really relevant to young faculty members. Like there's so many times where I didn't know exactly what to do, and now I'm on my own. So like, is there a support person that I can go and talk to about a tough clinical question? Or even like, what do we typically, or what does this practice typically do? So I'm not the person doing practicing different types of medicine than a lot of the other faculty members here, so that there's some consistency. I think that's also really helpful. And then just some of the nuts and bolts questions that I didn't realize that were kind of important, but like Max mentioned, like how long are civil service weeks? Who's on the service teams? Is it MP run? Is it fellow driven? How much do I have certain weeks with fellows, or is that split up in a specific pattern? What are the weekend calls like? How many overnight calls? And overnights, there were some practices where the fellows were in-house overnight, but at the other times, but they didn't have enough fellows to cover every call night. So like some call nights had a fellow in-house with you and they were the first call, but other call nights you didn't have a fellow and you were the first call. So there's a lot of different variations and some different aspects to that as well. I think also it's kind of helpful with the culture questions to kind of figure out what kind of the spread of the neonatology experience is on the team. So like, are you going to be the only junior faculty member? Are you going to be like pretty much one of, like, is most of the division young and there's not a lot of like mentorship there? Kind of getting a feel for that too, and seeing if there's a nice kind of diversity of the faculty itself is helpful too.
Great. I think those are all really good points. And I think I agree, focusing on culture and the division and where they see it going, give you a good look into, like you guys were saying, what you might be called upon to do. Did anybody else want to comment before we move on to the next question? Those are great answers. I always find that really challenging. Like, how do I get to the crux of like what I'm really trying to figure out here, especially when it's over Zoom initially too. So then the next question is, when you're thinking back to your prior contracts, are there particular things that you wish that you'd asked for or that were included? In addition to, just the standard boilerplate stuff? Were there things that you discussed with the chief and either had put in there or wish you'd had put in? And we'll start with Ashley and then go to Tom.
Yeah, I felt like I was well coached to ask about like research support, protected time, mentorship, like all of those things. Honestly, I wish I would have asked for more money. That was like the last thing. I just assumed, oh, this is just the standard contract. This is how much everybody gets. This is the starting amount. but I guess that doesn't mean everybody has to start there. So it wasn't until after I was hired and then the next cycle came in, and a fellow from the class below me, I found out, was making 40,000 more than me for their starting salary, which is a lot, but because they asked for it, right? So if you don't ask for more or say, and it helps to come back with comps. So, and I didn't know, because I went from Texas to DC, and so I didn't know, but when I came back, and then when I signed with my current job, I was way more researched with how much money are other people getting offered, and asked recent fellows through TECaN, like how much, people who have interviewed other places in these cities, like how much starting salary have people been quoted, and then got some negotiating advice, and just kind of went in, instead of this is how much I think is fair, I approached it with, well, I know that this is what all of my friends who are recent grads in these neighboring cities got. So can you help me understand what it is about my application that you think is not at least above that, or not comparable to that? I feel like I'm bringing a lot to the table, this training, this whatever that I'm being recruited here to build. So I'm having a hard time understanding why I'm being placed in that bracket. That was kind of how I approached it, in a little bit more of seeking understanding, and it worked. It got me more money. But I wish I had the guts to ask for the money. That, to me, I was so focused on all the other pieces.
Yeah, I would say it never hurts to ask any of these questions in terms of contract negotiations. So if there's something you feel strongly about or interested in, as long as you approach it in a respectful way, I would at least ask about it. My situation with this, with my current position, there was very little negotiation with salary itself, actually. And that was just because all junior faculty member make this amount, and it was just part of like a big academic center, which is also kind of reassuring from a equity, standpoint, making sure that everybody's fairly compensated and equally compensated. I will say that in some of the other interview processes that I went through, I sensed that there was certainly some wiggle room for salary negotiation. And then I've also heard some of my colleagues, people from my class, in some of their interviews, different things that they're able to negotiate was like moving expenses, and also stipends, like research funding, budget, and time. Time was a big thing for a lot of my colleagues, specifically those who are grant supported. And then one other one was, oh, it just slipped my mind. I'm sorry about that. But so there is definitely some wiggle room with contract stuff. Oh, the interesting one that I thought was funny too is one of my colleagues made sure that their contract included office space in their contract, so that if the division is expanding and there's not a lot of room in the current office buildings, if it's in your contract, then you will have an office moving forward, as opposed to kind of maybe working from home or like using a shared office if you're like primarily research or something like that. So that was an interesting tidbit I thought was funny too. Yeah, so that, unfortunately, I didn't do much of the contract negotiations. I will put in a plug though. I think that this is a good time just to say that, like, as you look through all this stuff, you'll be looking through the benefits and the retirement packages and all, not just the salary, but all the money that goes into your position that isn't necessarily shown just in the salary. So as you're kind of getting familiar with this stuff, it's helpful to kind of get some basic financial literacy of like what these retirement packages are, how they work, like how much money is, like what to do with this money and where it's all coming from. So I'll just put in a quick plug for that. It's also helpful to kind of get some of those chops in.
Great. I don't know. I feel like this is all so much information as I'm finishing up my first year. I'm trying to just like soak it all up as I go. But if no one else has any thoughts on that section, we're gonna kind of move into our next section here, which is gonna cover the topic of the transition from fellowship to attending, because it's really what most of us, I think, want to know. Besides the salary point, we do want to know what the transition is like. So first question is going to be for Ashley again. Number one is, because it's a multi-part question. So one, how is your work-life balance? And then do you feel like you had a fair amount of job like opportunity, like a fair amount of like variety, like in the opportunities while you were applying? And then the last one is a little bit loaded. Are you happy with your opportunities for career advancement?
This is a lot of questions.
That's a lot of questions packed into one. So let's just like, how about we just start off with like, how do you feel about your work-life balance?
Work-life balance, I always struggle with, but I think that's my own doing, not my job. So, you know, to have young children and be starting a new fellowship program and taking on leadership from a like neuro NICU and fetal center position, you know, that was what was attractive to me about this job. Is sometimes when you go to a smaller hospital that's growing, you get leadership opportunities earlier in your career stage, which is great. However, you know, I pack my schedule probably more than I should. That's me. I would say the average person in my division, you have a nice balance because we do 2-week stretches of service, and on average we do like 15 18 weeks, and then you do some calls intermixed. So I do feel like I see my family more regularly than doing a month of service with a really horrible commute, you know, in downtown DC and things like that. So in terms of work-life balance, it is better. And then I do feel like there are a lot of opportunities. I kind of answered that question with it in terms of, you know, the cycles. When I applied, I was looking at academic jobs that were clinical, as well as medical education QI, as well as private practice hybrid versus straight private practice. So, you know, we always have a need for neonatologists. My general sense is that the market is a little bit better now than it was like 2 years ago, with some financial like constraints lifted and a little bit better idea of COVID and funding and stuff like that. So I hope I answered enough of those questions.
Yeah, definitely. Max, how do you feel about your work-life balance, and then some of the things that we just talked about with Ashley?
Yeah, I think my work-life balance is great. I think that there is, I think part of that is trusting my boss. I think I got a lot of, because it's a small community in academic neonatology at least, that like among researchers and among academic folk, like people know division chiefs, and they have reputations. And I think that I got a lot of information from folks who knew my current boss, and that he is someone who, even though he said you're going to have to work more clinical weeks this year than we initially thought you were, I didn't feel like he was targeting me. I didn't feel like it was, you know, it was just like, okay, everyone's working more, like we all have to do it, and it kind of makes sense. And so I think that it's been easier, I think, because the ethos here is that people have lives. And the same way that I interviewed somewhere where they said, you know, I round on 50 patients on the weekends and usually they're till 8 p.m. Like I could tell that like that's someone who is having that as part of the schedule is not valuing that. And so some of it is just a little bit of trust with your boss to make sure that you have that, and getting that feedback from folks who know them, ideally. And I think that the transition generally has been good. I mean, I think in research that's a really tricky thing. I think in research, I think making sure that your mentorship program, I think like Ashley mentioned this already, is like the major thing. Like on a KO, you know, if you're doing NIH funding on a KO8, 50% of the scoring of that application is your environment. And like, yeah, you're great and you're smart, but like you need that mentorship, you need those people there. And so I think that that's been also something where it's set up, where I am at least, that like this is a place where we value junior faculty and we want to develop junior faculty. And I think that that's very lucky, but I also think that that's something that you should make sure is at least part, or at least can be part of your job. In talking with the division chief is like, look, I need you guys to help develop me, because you're not going to come as a fully developed like 10-year career neonatologist with this academic expertise. Like, you're still learning a lot. You're learning a lot about a new system, a lot about a new clinical system, and those I think are probably the biggest challenges, are the culture. I think one of my faculty in fellowship said like culture eats protocol for breakfast or something like that. Like the culture of a place is like determines what clinical practice is done, not what clinical practice you want to happen. And so that's what I would say.
Great. Davlin and or Tom, did you guys have any other thoughts on the topic of work-life balance?
Yeah, I would. It's always tough, and I think we always really struggle with it. But I would say is make sure that like this is your life and your career and your happiness, right? And if you're not happy, then you're going to burn out and you're going to shorten your career because you're going to get so frustrated. So it is a time to be somewhat selfish while still kind of making sure that you're adequately fostering your own development and career development. Now that's a lot of fluff and not a lot of hard stuff there, but I would really try to make sure that you stay happy and figure out what your stress reliefs are, so that like you can prioritize that time while if you have a family and you have a busy practice or a busy clinical time, that you are able to find productive and healthy ways to relieve your stress so that you can kind of refuel your tank to keep going, whatever that may be, whether it's quiet time, exercise, writing, reading, etc. It's really tough to kind of prioritize that stuff, but it's really important.
Yep, and I would say, similar to that, just try to stay true to yourself. And so especially when you start that first job and you're trying to find your footing and you're a fellow that's used to like doing everything and trying to add things to your CV, you can sort of look and say, oh my gosh, I have committed to 5 projects. Wow. And I may have overdone it. And so I think just trying to check in with yourself every few weeks and say, this is what I'm interested in, and ask yourself every time before you say yes, does this align with my goals? And I think that would help you sort of with that yes or no, and then just say, I don't have the bandwidth to take on this project at this time, but maybe later. So I think that's important. And always just don't feel guilty on those off days, even if you're studying for boards and things, to kind of find the things that matter and try to work on the work-life balance.
To piggyback off that, I was literally typing into the chat too, like those additional projects and committees and responsibilities that people want you to sign on for. Keep in mind that I would always prioritize what's in your contract and like what your promotions and all that stuff that you're expected to do, and make sure you do the stuff that you're expected to do really well before you then start watering down your expertise with maybe some other committees or projects that you feel less comfortable with and that are going to be really kind of draining on your time. So it's okay to be selfish from that standpoint. I think within reason, of course, you don't want to look like you're not willing to work and give back to the team.
Yeah, I think Patrick makes a point about, having like discussions with your partner and things like that are really important. I think that that's something that is pretty important, is that like as a fellow you're protected and you kind of there's always at least an ability to be like, you're protected in a very different way than when you're faculty, and you have to make sure that you have like a really kind of frank discussion with your partner about what things you're going to be willing to sacrifice and they're going to be willing to sacrifice, because I think regardless of what you do, this is a job where there are going to be days where something happens and you're going to be there till 7 p.m. or something like that, where you can't come home. And so, if you're navigating things with children or with your partner, or you have dogs or things like that, where there are a variety of things, I think like it's just important to have those discussions before you sign that contract, so that you're going to be in a position where you can balance those things, and there is an understanding of like, well, whose thing that they need to do right now is going to be prioritized right now, because it's not easy.
Great. I think all those were great answers, and just kind of what I'm getting as a summary is that it seems like you have to have a pretty strong sense of yourself and what balance actually means to you, before you can actually even make some of those decisions. So great. And kind of moving on to our next question, that I think is pretty interesting. How much time off did you guys take in between fellowship and then actually starting your job? And then within that, did you guys like negotiate moving stipends or not? Because I actually saw some comments on this in the chat. So I thought that this would be a good next question. And then Davlin, if you have any thoughts on that first.
Yes, I took time off. That was the advice that I did listen to. I think I officially took about 6 weeks off because I finished, I think, first week of July, and I officially started in end of August. But I also kind of that I think it would help to get a sense of that too. Like I started in August, but I didn't honestly start like clinical service time until the end of September, early October. So even then, it was sort of a just kind of prolonged orientation period, which also helped. And so I think just talking to your kind of division and talking to the new job and seeing what that actually looks like, because I thought that I was going to just kind of start from the jump. But yes, I got lots of advice, and I think the ongoing advice to just take that time off. Like fellowship is hard, and you just decompress and just to at least have some time, if you can financially, right? But if you can have some time to just have no responsibilities, at least for some time frame, I think that's definitely helpful. Moving stipend. So I wish I was as lucky, but I just got the moving stipend. I did ask about just getting it written in the contract as a bonus, but that was turned down. But again, you have to ask. So, but just because it was sort of presented in sort of this academic package, kind of through the College of Medicine, it was just this moving stipend that I had to get reimbursed for. But definitely take Ashley's advice and try to get that written in as an actual bonus.
I also took time off. It was an awesome decision. Highly recommend it if you have the financial means to do it. Not only to recharge your battery, but to celebrate. Like, you've completed training. You've done 10 years of training for this time. You deserve it. And do some fun stuff that you have been putting aside, and also recharge your hobbies, because now like that's one of the work-life balances things, to have some hobbies that you can do that aren't medicine as well too. So find those hobbies again. And if you have family, spend the time with your family. And I bet your spouse would appreciate it after all the sacrifices they've made for you along the way as well too. And clean the dishes every once in a while. So I did not move. I was fortunate to stay in the same area that I was doing training in. So moving expenses and stipends were not in my contract, or are not applicable in my case. But as I mentioned before, a lot of people, that was a big wiggle room for contract negotiations with moving expenses. So that's something that I would highly suggest doing. There was a part also with projects. I did not have any continued projects, but one that was kind of wrapping up. I would highly suggest that any kind of like lasting fellowship projects that are like in the final stages, no one's going to want to take those over just to like kind of do a little bit of extra work on it. So really try, if you're at the cusp of publication, to just like get it done before you finish up, so that you can get it submitted and hopefully get credit for all that work that you've done. It's really hard to transition all that work if it's like a chart review project to like another fellow, because no one thinks the way that you think, and it's really hard to kind of transition and give that organized thought to someone else. So if you're able to, try to sum up those projects. But I didn't have any other kind of research that was carrying over, like basic science or anything like that.
Great. So basically what I gathered from that was listen to your mentors, get good advice. So Patrick, I'm looking at you. I'll just listen at you. I already know how to do that. So great. Let's see. So our next question is, do you guys have any specific resources that you guys used in terms of transitioning from the fellowship to the attending role? That's basically just the question, if you guys have any specific resources. Ashley, the first person for this question.
Yeah, people. I think people is my biggest resource. The TECaN curbside signal group has been very helpful when it's 2 a.m. and you're just like wondering what to do in a clinical situation. I noticed one of the questions people, bring up is like asking for help, clinical help. That's honestly like finding your clinical sea legs and how you want to do it now that there's nobody else to tell you how you should do it is a big learning curve. But also if you're moving to a new place, like figuring people out, right? Like, who do you trust? Who is gonna tell everybody, oh, so-and-so, doesn't like the way we do this, whatever. Like, that's another thing of trying to find your allies. Hopefully, if you're sharing an office, that was honestly my saving grace, was my roommate got me through that year where we were both like, what do you do for this? And they're like, I have no idea. I have no idea either. Okay, well, at least we're normal and neither one of us have any idea. So I think that's important. And there's a balance to find of asking for help and just like, this is what I'm thinking. Does this sound right? Versus not asking enough and coming across like you already know everything, or you're just blatantly doing the way you did it in fellowship instead of following the protocols at your new place. Like, don't be that person where you go somewhere and you're just like, well, where I trained at XYZ, don't be that person. No one is gonna like that person. Wait like 6 months and then introduce some data, offer to lead a journal club, something like that, and then introduce another way of doing it if you feel really strongly. But you just kind of got a chameleon the first 6 months into wherever you transition to. So I think find your people, utilize your people, and then I mean, use TECaN. TECaN's a great network across the signal groups to just get a random thoughts on a question at whatever time of day.
Yeah, I agree. People. That was I was like, I don't have any books or resources. It's really just people. I really found my colleague that I was hired with was like, the colleagues that you're hired with are definitely going to be your allies. And so you sort of bounce ideas off of each other and then you take it higher. So that's typically what we would do. We would sort of show each other an x-ray and I'm like, I think you should get a third opinion on that. So yeah. And so then we would go to someone more senior, but I think definitely that, and even people outside of medicine, right? Like even just being transparent, like, for mental health and therapy and things of that nature, just to kind of decompress and debrief on what just happened in fellowship. So, and really, because I think with the transition, confidence is a big thing too, right? And just to sort of like, and that's during that time off, as far as your sort of work-life balance and self-care, thinking about that too, and taking advantage of those opportunities if you have them.
Yeah, actually, I'm not sure if you mentioned it as well too, but I may have heard it. But like your text thread with your co-fellows, like we still text each other all the time with specific clinical situations. Like, am I crazy? Did we do it this way that one time? Like, what do you guys think about this situation? Of course, HIPAA compliant and de-identified, but like keep those relationships going, because I mean, you've been through the ringer with a lot of close colleagues, and so they know you better than a lot of other people. they're helpful.
Great. So all of those were excellent questions. I've been keeping up on the time here. It seems like we're past the hour here. And I think that was actually a great question to kind of wrap things up on. And Sarah, do you have anything for the group?
Nope, I think that's it. Thank you all for so much really helpful advice. I think even having been through this, I'm still like, oh, I'm taking in all this additional stuff that like I hadn't thought to ask or will include in resources moving forward. So thank you all so much for being here and for talking with TECaN, ONTPD.